In the hot summer of 1965, the plains of Punjab were silent, but everyone knew something was coming. Along the border between India and Pakistan, soldiers stood guard in the dust and heat, watching each other through binoculars. Officially, there was peace. But in reality, the subcontinent was seconds away from a storm that would change history. The roots of the conflict went far beyond the border fences. Since the partition of 1947, both nations had fought over one piece of land, Kashmir. For years, skirmishes had broken out in the icy mountains, but what began as small clashes was about to turn into a full-scale war. It all started with Operation Gibraltar, a daring and secret plan by Pakistan to infiltrate forces into Indian-controlled Kashmir. The idea was simple but risky: send thousands of trained soldiers disguised as local Kashmiris to spark an uprising against India. If the population revolted, Pakistan would intervene as a liberator without declaring war. By late August 1965, groups of commandos began crossing the line of control under the cover of darkness. They carried light weapons, wireless radios, and enormous confidence. But there was one problem: the people of Kashmir didn't rise. Instead, they reported the infiltrators to the Indian army. Within days, India realized what was happening and decided to strike back. On September 1, 1965, India launched Operation Grand Slam, targeting the crucial town of Uknur in Jammu, a key supply route that could cut off entire regions. The first clashes were fierce: tanks roared, artillery thundered, and soldiers fought in trenches just meters apart. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but the fight was just beginning. Behind the front lines, both governments went into overdrive. Radio Pakistan broadcasted patriotic songs and fiery speeches calling it a war for dignity. Meanwhile, All India Radio countered with defiance, declaring that every inch of our soil will be defended. Civilians were told to stay calm, but everyone knew this was war. As the sun rose on September 6, 1965, Pakistan made a bold move that shocked India and the world. Before dawn, its army launched a surprise assault across the international border into Punjab, marking the official start of the Indo-Pak War of 1965. The target was the Indian city of Amritsar, and the objective was clear: to capture territory fast before international pressure could stop the war. The attack began with artillery fire and tank columns advancing under the dark sky. Indian soldiers, caught off guard, scrambled to defensive positions. Villages turned into battlefields, and the sound of machine guns echoed through the fields. The first few hours were chaos, but soon, Indian reinforcements arrived, and the battle lines began to harden. Meanwhile, the Indian Air Force, IAF, scrambled its fighters from Pathankot and Halwara airbases. The skies over Punjab lit up with dogfights: sabres versus gnats, hunters versus starfighters. Pilots on both sides fought with unmatched bravery, sometimes just seconds away from death. In one encounter, Indian pilot squadron leader Ajamita B. Devaya took on a superior Pakistani jet and downed it before being shot himself. His name later became a legend. In the background, the world watched nervously. The United Nations called for restraint, but neither side was ready to stop. Both countries believed they were fighting for survival, for honor, and for the soul of Kashmir. By the night of September 6, the war had spread across hundreds of kilometers from the deserts of Rajasthan to the snow-covered peaks of Kashmir. But the real battle, both sides knew, was yet to come. As tanks rolled through the moonlit fields and tracer rounds cut the night sky, one truth became clear: this would not be a short or simple war. It would test courage, faith, and sacrifice on a level neither side had ever imagined. The morning of September 6, 1965, arrived with a roar over the city of Lahore. The distant thunder wasn't rain, it was artillery. At 4:30 a.m., Indian tanks of the 15th Infantry Division crossed the border and advanced toward Lahore, hoping to capture it before sunrise. The plan was bold, almost desperate: a lightning strike to shock Pakistan into surrender. But the defenders of Lahore were ready. Pakistani forces, under Major General Sarfraz Khan and Major Shafkat Baloch, had dug in along the BRB Canal, a man-made barrier that would soon become legendary. As the first Indian tanks rumbled toward the canal, Pakistani artillery opened fire, lighting up the night like fireworks of war. Villagers near the front lines woke to the sound of explosions. The ground trembled as shells exploded in fields and houses. Civilians fled toward the city, carrying what little they could, while soldiers rushed toward the sound of battle. The city that had gone to sleep in peace was now on the edge of annihilation. By mid-morning, the Indian assault had reached the canal. Their tanks tried to cross using portable bridges, but the defenders held their ground. Pakistani soldiers blew up crossings, firing machine guns and mortars relentlessly. One name stood out that day: Major Aziz Bhatti, who commanded a small company along the canal's defense line. For 6 days, Bhatti refused to retreat, fighting from trench to trench, calling artillery fire dangerously close to his own position. Exhausted, wounded, and surrounded, he continued to lead his men until an enemy shell finally struck him. His courage turned him into a national hero, earning Pakistan's highest military honor, Nishan-e-Haider. As Lahore burned under the smoke of war, the front lines shifted toward Sialkot, where the next decisive chapter of the conflict began. The Indian Army launched Operation Nepal, aiming to cut off the Grand Trunk Road and split Pakistan's defenses. But Pakistan had a surprise of its own: the 6th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Abrar Hussain, one of the best armored formations in Asia. The fields near Chawinda, a small Punjabi village, became the stage for one of the largest tank battles since World War II. The flat terrain was perfect for armor and both sides poured everything they had into it. More than 400 tanks from India and Pakistan faced off in a deadly game of fire and maneuver. The ground shook as hundreds of tanks advanced, firing shells that turned fields into craters. Smoke, dust, and fire covered the horizon. Communication broke down, visibility was zero. Crews fought blind, guided only by the flash of enemy guns. Some tanks exploded in seconds, others burned for hours, turning night into a red haze. One Pakistani soldier later recalled, "The earth was on fire. You couldn't tell where the sky ended and the ground began." The Battle of Chawinda raged for days. Both armies claimed victories, both suffered immense losses. But it was the Pakistani resistance that stunned the world. Against superior numbers, they held their ground, forcing India to halt its advance. When the smoke cleared, the battlefield was littered with twisted metal and silence, a grim reminder of the cost of war. While the tank battles dominated headlines, smaller clashes erupted everywhere. In the deserts of Rajasthan, soldiers fought in blistering heat where water was scarcer than ammunition. In Kashmir, mountain units battled through rain and snow, ambushing supply convoys and fighting hand-to-hand in narrow passes. Back home, both nations were gripped by war fever. In Pakistan, patriotic songs filled the airwaves. "I Ra-e-Haq Ku Shahido" played on radios as families prayed for sons and brothers at the front. In India, posters called for unity and sacrifice. Civilians donated blood, money, and food. The entire subcontinent seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. But as days turned into weeks, the cost of the conflict began to show. Thousands of soldiers on both sides had been killed or wounded. Ammunition supplies were running low. The air forces had suffered heavy losses. Brave pilots on both sides had fallen, their planes now wrecks in fields and mountains. Internationally, the pressure to end the war grew stronger. The United States and Soviet Union, both fearing that the conflict could spiral into a larger regional crisis, began pushing for a ceasefire. The United Nations convened emergency meetings, urging both nations to pull back. But neither side wanted to stop first. Pride, politics, and sacrifice had made retreat impossible. Even as diplomats met in New York, artillery still thundered on the front lines. In one of the most dramatic episodes of the war, Indian forces attempted another push toward Sialkot on September 18, hoping to break through before negotiations took hold. Pakistani reinforcements rushed in, and once again the fields erupted in chaos. Shells screamed overhead, soldiers fought at point-blank range. At last, when it seemed both sides could fight no more, the United Nations ceasefire came into effect on September 23, 1965. The guns fell silent, but the silence was uneasy. Both countries declared victory. In Pakistan, people celebrated in the streets. In India, the press hailed its soldiers as heroes. But the truth was more complex. Tens of thousands were dead or displaced, and the border had barely moved. Still, the war had changed everything. It gave birth to legends, pride, and pain on both sides of the border. And it left behind a message that time has never erased, that courage and sacrifice know no boundaries, and that every war, no matter who claims victory, leaves behind scars that never truly fade. As the soldiers returned home and the dust settled over Punjab's battlefields, one question remained unanswered: had either nation really won? When the guns finally fell silent on September 23, 1965, the world exhaled in relief. But behind the silence lay secrets and a war that had only changed its shape. The battlefields had stopped burning, but the political fires were just beginning to spread. In both India and Pakistan, the governments claimed victory. Newspapers printed bold headlines, parades filled the streets, and the sound of celebration replaced the thunder of shells. But inside closed rooms, generals and politicians knew the truth: the war had ended without a winner. The ceasefire left both nations exhausted. Thousands of soldiers never returned. Entire villages near the front lines had vanished under the weight of artillery and airstrikes. Economies shattered, supply lines broken, and public morale dangerously divided. And yet something else had changed. The 1965 war marked the moment the Cold War truly reached South Asia. The United States, once a strong ally of Pakistan, began to step back. Washington had expected Pakistan to stay focused on containing Soviet influence, not open a full-scale war in Kashmir. In response, the U.S. froze military aid, a decision that would change Pakistan's defense strategy forever. In the shadows, new alliances began to form. Pakistan turned toward China, which had just fought its own war with India 3 years earlier in 1962. Beijing saw an opportunity to build a new friendship that would shift the balance of power in Asia. Within months, the first defense agreements were signed, laying the foundation for a partnership that would last decades. India, on the other hand, leaned closer to the Soviet Union. Moscow, eager to counter U.S. influence, began supplying advanced weapons and aircraft to New Delhi. The subcontinent had been divided not just by borders, but by ideology. From Washington to Moscow, every superpower now had a hand in South Asia's destiny. But even as world powers moved their pieces, a quieter, more dangerous game was being played: the war of intelligence. In the months leading up to the conflict, Pakistan's military intelligence, ISI, had launched a covert mission known as Operation Gibraltar. The plan: send disguised troops across the line of control to spark rebellion in Indian-held Kashmir. It was meant to be silent, invisible, a spark that would ignite a larger uprising. But something went wrong. The infiltrators were discovered. Local resistance didn't rise as expected, and instead of a rebellion, India launched a massive counterattack. What was designed as a secret operation turned into a full-scale war. Many within Pakistan's own military questioned the decision. Some believed the plan was rushed, others said it was based on flawed intelligence. The fallout was enormous. While the world focused on tanks and artillery, the real battle was happening behind the scenes in secret reports, intercepted radio calls, and diplomatic backchannels. In India too, questions arose. How had a large infiltration gone undetected for so long? Why had their early intelligence failed to predict the scale of Pakistan's moves? Secret inquiries began, and agencies were reshaped. The war had exposed weaknesses on both sides, and both were determined never to repeat them. Meanwhile, in Tashkent, the Soviet Union offered to mediate peace. It was January 1966, and under the icy skies of Uzbekistan, two leaders Lal Bahadur Shastri of India and Ayub Khan of Pakistan met face to face. The world's cameras flashed as they shook hands, but the smiles hid 1,000 unspoken words. The Tashkent Declaration officially ended the conflict, calling for troop withdrawals and a return to pre-war borders. But behind closed doors, the meeting was tense. Ayub Khan faced immense pressure at home. Many Pakistanis felt the army had fought bravely but been forced into peace too soon. In India, Shastri's quiet strength earned him respect, but his sudden death the very next day in Tashkent shocked the world and fueled decades of conspiracy theories. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was it a heart attack, or something darker? Even today, no one knows for sure. In the months that followed, both countries began rebuilding not just their armies, but their identities. In Pakistan, the war was remembered as a symbol of unity and defiance. Songs, poems, and documentaries celebrated the courage of soldiers like Major Aziz Bhatti and squadron leader M. Alam, who shot down 5 Indian aircraft in under a minute, a world record still remembered today. In India, too, the war became part of national pride. Heroes like Abdul Hamid, who destroyed enemy tanks with his recoilless gun, became legends. Schools taught their names, cities built statues, and every anniversary brought parades and remembrance. But beneath the heroism lay a haunting realization: the conflict had solved nothing. The line of control still divided Kashmir. The mistrust had only deepened. And while the people of both nations buried their dead, the governments quietly began preparing for what they knew was inevitable: the next war. Intelligence agencies expanded, military budgets rose, and secret alliances deepened. By the end of the 1960s, the subcontinent was armed, watchful, and restless once again. As one historian later wrote, "The War of 1965 was not a conclusion, it was a rehearsal for the wars to come." And indeed, within just 6 years, the world would once again hear the drums of conflict, this time in 1971, when the map of South Asia would change forever. But that, as they say, is another story. The forgotten War of 1965, or as some call it, the Battleground of 1967, remains a lesson written in courage and confusion. A story of men who fought with honor, and of leaders who gambled with fate. It reminds us that wars don't end with ceasefires, they end only when history stops repeating itself. As the smoke of the 1965 war faded from the skies, both nations tried to rebuild what they had lost: land, pride, and peace. But for those who had stood on the front lines, the war never truly ended. Every gunshot, every scream, every order shouted across the battlefield lived on in their dreams, in their memories, in their silence. The soldiers who returned home found themselves in a different kind of war: the struggle to live again. Many carried shrapnel in their bodies, others carried guilt in their hearts. Some never spoke again about what they had seen. Because sometimes, silence is the only way to survive what words cannot explain. In Pakistan, heroes like Major Aziz Bhatti became immortal symbols of sacrifice. Streets, schools, and institutions carried their names. In India, Company Quartermaster Havildar Abdul Hamid became a legend, awarded the Paramveer Chakra for single-handedly destroying enemy tanks in Kemkaran. Yet, beyond the parades and medals, ordinary families grieved quietly. Fathers who never came home. Letters that stopped arriving. And children who grew up hearing bedtime stories not of fairy tales but of wars fought in their fathers' names. By late 1966, both governments were trying to rewrite the narrative to turn a costly stalemate into a symbol of national pride. State media, films, and songs celebrated the victory. But in private, generals reviewed maps, marked mistakes, and prepared for the next inevitable clash. Because deep inside, they all knew, Kashmir was still unresolved and peace was temporary. The intelligence networks grew stronger. Pakistan expanded the ISI's operations, building new connections with Beijing and Middle Eastern allies. India restructured its defense command, expanding its air force and armor divisions. And behind the curtains of diplomacy, both sides began what historians now call the Silent Decade, a period of preparation that would later explode into the 1971 war. But before that, something more subtle began to happen. A psychological war of propaganda, misinformation, and national identity. Schools rewrote textbooks, politicians blamed the other side, and generations grew up believing that the next war was not just possible but necessary. Across the border villages, barbed wire lines began to rise. Trains that once crossed freely between Lahore and Amritsar now stood abandoned. The same people who had once traded, married, and celebrated together now looked at each other through suspicion and scars. The human cost of the conflict was far greater than what governments admitted. Over 6,000 soldiers had lost their lives, and tens of thousands were injured. But the civilians, farmers, women, children were the invisible victims. In Sialkot, villages were burned to ashes, in Punjab, families were displaced. And in Kashmir, life became a constant reminder that peace was only a pause between wars. Yet in the midst of despair, there were stories of humanity that defied politics. An Indian doctor treating wounded Pakistani soldiers after a ceasefire. Pakistani villagers helping stranded Indian prisoners find food and shelter. Moments that proved even in war compassion could survive the fire. But history doesn't rest. By 1969, the region's political landscape began to crack again. Pakistan faced internal unrest. Students and labor unions protested against President Ayub Khan's rule. In India, the Congress party fractured, and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi rose to power strong, ambitious, and determined to reshape her country's destiny. While politicians fought in parliaments, the military watched the borders. Each side testing radar systems, strengthening bunkers, and collecting intelligence. In the shadow of victory celebrations, both sides were already preparing for the next storm. And then came 1971, the year when the subcontinent would change forever. It started as a political crisis in East Pakistan, where Bengali nationalism and calls for independence grew stronger. But what began as protests would soon turn into one of the largest humanitarian and military crises in modern history. And many historians believe the roots of that war began here, in 1965. Because the lessons of 1965, the unhealed wounds, the mistrust, and the belief in force over dialogue became the foundation for the next conflict. Had peace been pursued differently, perhaps history would have taken another path. But wars are written by choices and by the men who make them. In the decades that followed, both nations continued to honor their heroes. Every year, flags are raised, anthems are sung, and the courage of those who fought is remembered. But as we look back, one question still remains. Was it worth it? For every border gained, how many lives were lost? For every medal awarded, how many tears were shed? For every victory, how many families still wait for closure? Battleground 1967, as some soldiers used to call it, is not just a story about tanks and trenches. It's about the human cost of ambition, pride, and politics. It's a reminder that wars may create heroes, but they also create ghosts. And those ghosts, they don't live in graveyards. They live in memories, in maps, and in the silence between two nations that once shared the same song. As the documentary fades, imagine a soldier's voice echoing softly. We fought, we bled, we lost, and yet, the war never really ended. It just changed its shape. The screen darkens. The sound of a distant bugle plays. And the final words appear.